Shoot the terrorists, not the children,
Right.
not the women.
We really do all what we can not to hurt the citizens. For example, these days, actually today,
You kill more than 70,000 civilians.
no,
There are more than. My solution is that go to the UN, work with the UN, and agree the two-state solution to establish a state of Palestine. Then you have two states, and you can work together with the Palestinians together to fight against terrorists. If you do not work with the Palestinians together, you can never win the war over terrorists.
No, but this specific war will end when the terror organization will release all our hostages and will give up his weapon, because we can't stop the war as long as we have the hostages.
No, this kind of propaganda have too many. No one believe it.
Too many what?
Too many, too much. No one believe it, except few Israelis.
The world can no longer close its eyes to what is happening in Gaza. The number of civilian casualties keeps rising, and with every explosion, with every collapsed building, the cries of victims echo far beyond the borders of Palestine. In the middle of this tragedy, a heated confrontation at an international forum suddenly captured global attention. A Chinese academic, calm yet firm, stood face to face with an Israeli general and demanded accountability. What about the civilians in Gaza? What about the children, the women, the elderly who have become victims of war? The room froze. The Israeli general, who was expected to confidently defend his country's actions, was caught off guard. For the first time in such a public space, Israel's narrative of defending itself was challenged head-on by a voice from Asia. And not just any voice, but China, a rising global power whose statements are carefully watched by allies and rivals alike. This moment marked more than just a heated exchange of words. It became a symbol of how the narrative war around Gaza is no longer monopolized by Israel and its Western backers. The confrontation revealed something deeper, that even in the halls of diplomacy, Israel is being forced to answer questions it can no longer easily dismiss. What happened in that room quickly spread across social media platforms, sparking debates not only in the Middle East but also in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. It signaled that the issue of Gaza is no longer confined to regional politics. It has transformed into a global moral question. And the world, it seems, is increasingly unwilling to stay silent. The Israeli representative tried to respond. He repeated the usual line, that Israel does not target civilians, that every operation in Gaza is aimed solely at dismantling Hamas infrastructure. But the words sounded hollow against the backdrop of endless footage showing destroyed neighborhoods, overcrowded hospitals, and grieving families carrying the bodies of children wrapped in white cloth. The Chinese academic pressed further, refusing to let the general escape behind carefully rehearsed talking points. If Israel is truly fighting Hamas, he asked, why are schools, hospitals, and refugee camps being hit? Why are international aid convoys being blocked? And how do you justify the deaths of thousands of civilians? The general shifted uncomfortably. His face tightened as cameras zoomed in. For Israel, this was not just a debate, it was a public relations nightmare. The confrontation highlighted the deep gap between Israel's official narrative and the harsh realities on the ground in Gaza. Observers in the room whispered that this was one of the rare times Israel seemed cornered in an international forum. Usually, American and European representatives quickly step in to shield Tel Aviv from criticism. But this time, the challenge came from a global heavyweight that Washington cannot easily dismiss: China. The exchange revealed more than just clashing viewpoints. It underscored the growing divide between the Western narrative, where Israel is seen as defending itself, and the perspective of much of the global South, where Israel's actions are increasingly viewed as war crimes. The symbolic weight of a Chinese figure confronting an Israeli general was powerful. It showed the shifting balance of global influence in the information war surrounding Gaza. For many watching around the world, this was not just about Gaza. It was about truth, power, and the struggle to shape global opinion. And in that moment, Israel was no longer in control of the narrative. In the days following the confrontation, clips of the exchange spread like wildfire across social media. On TikTok, YouTube, and X, millions watched as the Chinese academic held the Israeli general accountable in real time. The scene became a rallying point for activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens who felt their voices had long been ignored. Finally, one viral post read, "Someone dared to say what the world has been thinking." What made the moment so significant was not only the embarrassment it caused Israel, but also the platform on which it occurred, an international security forum attended by diplomats, academics, and media from dozens of countries. The optics were devastating for Tel Aviv. A military official, representing one of the most advanced armies in the world, was left fumbling for answers in front of a global audience. Meanwhile, Chinese state media amplified the clip, framing it as proof that Beijing is willing to stand on the side of justice and humanity. For China, the incident became an opportunity to project itself as the voice of the voiceless, a counterweight to American dominance in shaping international discourse. Analysts quickly pointed out that this was not just about moral positioning, but also about strategic influence in the Middle East and beyond. In Europe, reactions were mixed. While some governments continued to echo Washington's line of unconditional support for Israel, others, especially Spain, Ireland, and Belgium, grew bolder in criticizing Tel Aviv. In contrast, the United States doubled down on its defense of Israel, repeating that Hamas bears full responsibility for civilian deaths. Yet the images from Gaza told a different story, and the viral confrontation only deepened the cracks in Western unity. The stage was shifting. The battle for hearts and minds had moved far beyond Gaza's borders. It was now a fight over credibility, legitimacy, and the power to define reality itself. And in that fight, Israel was no longer unchallenged. The confrontation also revealed how fragile Israel's diplomatic shield has become. For decades, Tel Aviv relied on Washington's unwavering support to silence criticism in international arenas. Whenever tough questions arose, American officials would step in, shifting the focus back to Israel's right to self-defense. But this time, things played out differently. The world was watching closely, and the voice challenging Israel came from a country powerful enough that even Washington could not dismiss it outright. China's move was calculated. By raising the issue of civilian deaths in Gaza, Beijing was not only appealing to global public opinion, but also signaling to the developing world that it is willing to confront injustice where the West remains silent. In doing so, China positioned itself as a defender of international law and humanitarian values, an image that resonates strongly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where memories of colonialism and double standards still run deep. For Israel, the optics were disastrous. Its representative looked cornered, defensive, and unconvincing. The contrast was clear. On one side, China projecting calm authority and moral clarity. On the other, Israel struggling to justify images of bombed-out schools, overcrowded refugee camps, and grieving families. Diplomatic analysts noted that the incident might mark the beginning of a wider shift. If more countries follow China's example, openly questioning Israel in international forums, the long-standing Western narrative may erode faster than expected. Already, protests in European capitals are growing larger, with demonstrators demanding their governments cut military ties with Israel. This is not just about Gaza. It is about the credibility of the international system itself. How long can institutions preach human rights while turning a blind eye to civilian massacres? How long can Israel rely on the same justifications before they collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence? The confrontation in that forum was more than a war of words. It was a warning shot that the information battlefield is changing. And Israel, once untouchable, is now being forced onto the defensive. Beyond the walls of diplomatic forums, the ripple effects of the confrontation spread into unexpected arenas. In sports, culture, and media, voices challenging Israel's narrative grew louder. In Spain, lawmakers openly threatened to boycott major football tournaments unless FIFA took a firmer stance on Israel's actions in Gaza. Former football star Eric Cantona went viral after calling for a moral boycott, arguing that athletes cannot remain silent while civilians are slaughtered. These acts may appear symbolic, but their impact is real. Sports and entertainment reach audiences that politics often cannot. When stadiums, fan groups, and cultural icons raise their voices, they shape public opinion on a massive scale. For Israel, this represents another front in the information war, one where bombs and tanks are useless, and where moral credibility matters most. At the same time, media outlets across Latin America and Africa began devoting more airtime to Gaza, contrasting the devastation on the ground with Israel's official statements. In South Africa, comparisons with apartheid resurfaced, fueling debates about sanctions and accountability. In the Arab world, Coverage of the confrontation between China and the Israeli general was broadcast repeatedly, framed as proof that global powers are beginning to shift. Meanwhile, Washington sought to contain the damage. American officials quickly reassured Israel of unwavering support, emphasizing that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorism. Yet behind closed doors, reports suggested growing unease within European capitals. Leaders in London, Paris, and Berlin faced mounting pressure from their citizens, who increasingly questioned why Western governments appeared indifferent to Palestinian suffering. The message was clear: the battle over Gaza was no longer limited to rockets and airstrikes. It had expanded into the courts of global opinion, into stadiums, parliaments, and television screens. And in that space, Israel's grip on the narrative was slipping. The pressure mounted further when influential academics and civil society groups began to weigh in. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, universities hosted panels dissecting the legality of Israel's actions in Gaza. Reports from human rights organizations pointed to possible violations of international law. Terms like collective punishment and war crimes began to appear more frequently in mainstream media. For the Israeli government, these were red flags. While military superiority gave Israel dominance on the battlefield, it offered no protection against a crumbling image abroad. Diplomats understood that once the label of war criminal takes hold in the court of global opinion, reversing it is nearly impossible. The Chinese intervention at the forum provided momentum for these narratives. Beijing framed its challenge not merely as a defense of Palestinians, but as a stand for international law and human dignity. This resonated strongly in countries of the global south, where skepticism toward Western double standards is already high. The symbolism was powerful, a global power openly questioning Israel's conduct in front of the world, refusing to accept silence as an answer. Meanwhile, activists in Europe and North America intensified their campaigns. Universities saw growing protests demanding divestment from companies supplying weapons to Israel. Influential voices in the arts and entertainment world joined calls for boycotts. Even within the United Nations, several member states began lobbying for stronger resolutions condemning the assault on Gaza. For Washington, this presented a dilemma. On one hand, the U.S. could not afford to weaken its alliance with Israel. On the other, it risked alienating global opinion by ignoring the mounting evidence of civilian suffering. Former officials warned that America's credibility on human rights would continue to erode if it shielded Israel unconditionally. This was the larger story unfolding. Gaza was no longer just a conflict between Israel and Hamas. It had become a test case for the integrity of international norms, a battlefield where legitimacy was as important as military might. And in this arena, Israel was struggling to maintain control. As the debate intensified, cracks in Western unity began to show. In Washington, officials doubled down on support for Israel, insisting that Hamas was solely responsible for the crisis in Gaza. Yet in European capitals, leaders faced growing unrest at home. Massive demonstrations filled the streets of Madrid, Dublin, Brussels, and London, with tens of thousands demanding an end to military cooperation with Israel. Citizens questioned why their governments continued to defend Tel Aviv while images of destroyed hospitals and lifeless children dominated global headlines. Spain took the boldest step, threatening to push for sanctions within the European Union if Israel's offensive did not stop. Ireland openly condemned what it called indiscriminate bombings, while Belgium pressed for an arms embargo. Though not all EU members were willing to follow, the cracks were unmistakable. The political cost of unconditional support for Israel was rising. At the same time, voices from Latin America grew sharper. Leaders in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia condemned Israel's actions, with some recalling their ambassadors from Tel Aviv. South Africa, drawing on its own history of apartheid, pushed for international investigations into war crimes. These moves echoed loudly across the global south, strengthening the perception that Western nations were increasingly isolated in defending Israel. The viral exchange between the Chinese academic and the Israeli general only amplified these divisions. In much of the world, the clip symbolized a turning point, proof that Israel could no longer dominate the narrative unchallenged. Analysts observed that Beijing was not acting in isolation, but as part of a broader trend where rising powers and developing nations demanded a greater voice in global affairs. For Israel, the consequences were severe. While military operations continued in Gaza, the diplomatic battlefield was slipping away. Every strike, every civilian death, and every unanswered question fueled the perception of Israel as a state operating above international law. And once that perception takes root, it is not easily undone. In Beijing, Chinese officials delivered a sharp rebuke directly to the Israeli military leadership. During a high-profile diplomatic forum, China openly challenged General Herzl Halevi, the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, confronting him on Israel's military operations in Gaza. Chinese representatives emphasized that the global community cannot remain silent in the face of what they described as serious violations of international law and potential war crimes. What made the moment striking was China's willingness to use blunt language in a public setting. Instead of carefully worded diplomatic phrases, Beijing accused Israel of causing disproportionate civilian casualties, devastating infrastructure, and worsening the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. This was not just criticism. It was a direct attempt to humiliate an Israeli general on the world stage. Observers note that China's message was aimed not only at Israel but also at Washington, showing Beijing's readiness to position itself as the global defender of international law and humanitarian principles. For many countries frustrated with Western silence, China's words resonated loudly.